In the year 1700, a storm was brewing in northern Europe. On one side, a grand coalition, Russia under Peter the Great, Denmark-Norway, and Saxony-Poland, Lithuania. On the other, the Swedish Empire, a Baltic powerhouse led by a boy king, a teenager barely 18 years old named Charles XII. His enemies saw an easy victory, a chance to carve up a mighty empire. They were about to learn a brutal lesson. This is the story of the Meteor King, the rise and catastrophic fall of Charles XII. When the Great Northern War began, Sweden's enemies struck from three sides. They thought the young king would be paralyzed by indecision. Instead, Charles unleashed a blitzkrieg, 18th century style. He ignored Saxony and Russia for the moment and aimed straight for the heart of the closest threat, Denmark. With audacious speed, he personally led his army across the sea, landing just miles from Copenhagen. The Danes, utterly stunned by the ferocity and speed of the Swedish landing, capitulated almost immediately. In a matter of weeks, Charles had knocked his first enemy out of the war. One down, two to go. Europe took notice. This was no ordinary king. With Denmark neutralized, Charles turned his army east. His next target was the massive Russian force besieging the Swedish fortress of Narva in modern-day Estonia. On paper, it was a suicide mission. The Swedes were outnumbered at least 4-1. But Charles had an ally, the weather. On the day of the battle, a blinding snowstorm blew directly into the faces of the Russian army, concealing the Swedish advance. Charles ordered a full-scale assault. His elite Karelians, disciplined and fearless, smashed into the Russian lines. Panic ripped through the poorly trained Russian ranks. What followed was a total rout. The Swedes captured the entire Russian artillery and an immense number of prisoners. The victory at Narva was legendary, cementing Charles's reputation as a military genius. He had humbled Peter the Great and made the Swedish army seem invincible. After Narva, the world expected Charles to march on Moscow and finish the war. But he made a fateful decision. He believed Peter the Great was a broken man and Russia a shattered power. The real threat, in his mind, was Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. So, instead of finishing Russia, Charles turned south, getting bogged down in a multi-year campaign in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was determined not just to defeat Augustus, but to depose him and install his own puppet king. This Polish distraction gave his most dangerous enemy, Peter the Great, the one thing he needed most: time. While Charles was chasing Augustus through the forests and plains of Poland, Peter was rebuilding, rearming, and reforming his army. He studied the Swedish tactics that had crushed him at Narva and began building a new, modern Russian military. Charles was winning battles in Poland, but he was slowly losing the war. Finally, after years of campaigning, Charles had secured Poland. It was 1707. He was at the zenith of his power. Now, he turned his attention back to Russia. It was time to finish Peter the Great once and for all. He assembled a massive army, one of the finest Sweden had ever produced, and marched east. The plan was to strike directly at Moscow. But the Russia he faced now was not the Russia of 1700. Peter had adopted a scorched earth strategy. As the Swedes advanced, the Russians retreated, burning villages, destroying crops, and poisoning wells. The brutal Russian winter of 1708, one of the coldest in history, descended upon the Swedish army. Supplies ran low. Soldiers froze to death in their camps. Frostbite and starvation became as deadly as any Russian soldier. The once great army was slowly being bled dry, not in a great battle, but by the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Russian steppe. The road to Moscow was becoming a road to ruin. Weakened and desperate, Charles abandoned the march on Moscow. He turned south, towards Ukraine, hoping to find supplies and link up with allies. This diversion led him to a small fortress called Poltava. Here, in the summer of 1709, the decisive battle of the war would be fought. But this was not the Charles of Narva. A few weeks before the battle, he was shot in the foot while scouting, leaving him unable to lead from the front. The Swedish army, a shadow of its former self, was exhausted and outnumbered. The new Russian army, disciplined and well-equipped, awaited them. The Battle of Poltava was a disaster for the Swedes. Their army was annihilated. The myth of Swedish invincibility was shattered in a single day. Charles himself barely escaped, fleeing south with a small retinue into the Ottoman Empire, becoming a guest, and later, a political pawn, of the Sultan. His grand army was gone, and he was a king in exile. Charles spent 5 long years in the Ottoman Empire, a period often called his exile. He constantly tried to persuade the Sultan to attack Russia, and for a time, he succeeded, but ultimately, his presence became an inconvenience. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army. Finally, in 1714, he made a legendary journey back to Swedish territory, riding on horseback across Europe in disguise. He arrived to find his empire crumbling. His enemies had re-entered the war, and Swedish provinces were falling one by one. But Charles was not broken. He immediately began raising new armies, determined to fight on. He launched an invasion of Norway, hoping to conquer new lands to trade for lost territories. It was during a siege of the Fredrikstad fortress in 1718 that the final mystery of his life unfolded. While inspecting the trenches one night, he was struck in the head by a projectile and killed instantly. To this day, historians debate whether the fatal shot came from the Norwegian defenders or from a Swedish assassin within his own ranks. Charles XII was dead at 36. His death ended the Great Northern War and the Swedish Empire's time as a major European power. From boy king to military prodigy, from conqueror to exile, his life was a whirlwind that reshaped the map of Europe, leaving behind a legacy as brilliant and as fleeting as a shooting star. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the life of the Lion of the North, please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic history stories. We'll see you in the next one.